So in this video, we will look at how can we prepare the diagnostic and outlier question and multiple choices question as well. So before I talk about diagnostic and outlier question, let me mention a little bit about the multiple choices question. So the multiple choices question is related to chapter 5 and chapter 6. So mainly you need to review the binomial distribution and the characteristics for normal distribution. And we will see a few questions related to the multiple regression model. And you need to know what is the y variable and what is your x variable. So which one is a predicted variable and which one is a predicting variable. So you need to have a very clear definition or concept about y and x. You shouldn't, after this semester, you shouldn't only know x and y variable. You should know what they really mean in the regression model. So now we can look at our diagnostic questions. So based on the diagnostic, is there any assumption violated? So the assumption 1 is a linear relationship. So what you need to do is you need to do the scatter plot, x versus y. However, we will focus on our second assumption. So what is our second assumption? So assumption 2 is the standard deviation of a residual is the same regardless of the given value of x. So what kind of plot we will use to test this assumption? So you must remember the name of the graph. So the name of the graph to test this assumption is called residual versus the predicted y value. So we will test assumption 2, the standard deviation of residual is the same regardless of given value of x. So how can we create the residual versus predicted value of y? So let's look at our handout again. So actually, if you look at the Excel output, we call the residual output. So for this section, we have one column called observation. Let's see the column 1. Column 2 is the predicted price. So actually, this is our predicted y. Column 3 is residual. Column 4 is standard residual. So in order to test the assumption 2, we use the residual against the predicted y. So when you choose the x axis on the Excel, and actually you will choose our column 2, and y axis you will choose our column 3. So this plot is called residual versus predicted y value. So now let's look at assumption 2, finish assumption 2. So how can you decide if assumption 2 is violated or not? So I highly recommend you to look at the answer key for Excel Home 5 and also the file I sent out before Excel Home 5 called How to Diagnostics and Outlier Question Example. So actually, you are looking at if the scatter is approximately the same for all value of predicted y value. If it is the same, so this is assumption is not valid. Second, if you see the shape of this dot, it looks like a rectangle shape scatter plot, then this assumption is not violated. So for this example, you can see it's not a rectangle shape, it looks like a cone shaped. So we think this assumption is violated based on this plot. So it's called residual and predicted y value. So now let's look at our second assumption. Assumption 3, the population of arrows or residual is the normal distributed with a mean 0. So for this assumption, we will test first normal distributed. The second is a mean 0. So if we want to test the mean 0, which plot we will use? So figure 2 again. So we will use the residual versus predicted y value again to test the mean 0. So when mean 0 is not violated, when the points are distributed about the horizontal line at the 0, so the assumption is not violated. So how can we test the normal distributed in assumption 3? So we will use the plot called normal probability plot. So pay attention for the name of this plot called a normal probability plot. So how can you get normal probability plot? After you check the regression and the one of the plot came out with the regression is called normal probability plot, you will see an increasing dot. Sometimes look like straight line, sometimes not. So how can you know this assumption is not violated? Look at this analysis. So when the dot for approximately the straight line, so this assumption will not violated. If this dot is not a straight line, so this assumption is violated. Again, you need to know, in order to test normal distributed, you need to use normal probability plot. So that's the name for this plot you need to remember. So how about assumption 4? So the assumption 4 is the residual are independent of each other. So in this plot, in this assumption, we will use residual against the order plot. So for this case, we need to draw this plot by ourselves. So how can we draw it? So we will actually, in order to test the assumption 4, we will use the scatter plot. We will use the residual against the order observation plot. So when you're using the Excel, the x-axis, you will choose the column 1, and the y-axis, you will choose column 3. So when under the condition, you will think the assumption 4 is not violated. So if you see this plot, you will see a big U shape here, and then we will think assumption is violated. If you don't see the U shape, significant big U shape in your residual against order plot, and you will get conclusion the assumption is not violated. Once you see the U shape in your scatter plot, you will think this assumption is violated. Again, you will use the plot called residual against the order plot to test assumption 4. So that is all about assumption diagnostics. So how about the last question? Can you find outliers? So how can you find outliers? Use the plot. So first, let's get familiar with the name of the plot. The name of the plot called standard residual versus predicted y-value plot. And so how can we get this plot? So after we get our Excel output, again, we have this area, residual output. In order to test the outliers, we will use the predictive y versus standard residual. So in this case, the x-axis is our column 2, and the y-axis, we will no longer use column 3, but we will use column 4. So we use column 4 against column 2, create our residual, standard residual against predicted y-value plot. So the next question is, how can we find outliers? Actually, what we need to do is we will look at how many dots is larger than positive 2, which is outside the 2, and smaller than negative 2, so it's outside the negative 2. So in this case, we can find the largest point is below 1.5, so which is smaller than positive 2, and the smallest point is larger than negative 1.5, so it's larger than the negative 2, so which means all the point is between 2 and the negative 2, so we cannot find outliers. So again, first you need to remember the name of the plot. It's called standard residual versus predicted y. And the second, you need to know how to get this plot. And third, you need to know where to find the outliers. So this is a criterion. If the point within 2 and negative 2, there is no outlier. If you can find that the point is larger than 2 and less than negative 2, we will find outliers. So that is all for the question and review related to the diagnostic outliers and the multiple choices.